Good evening. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Elizabeth Hinton presenting her new book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. She'll be in conversation with Derecka Purnell. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Boston Review, a political and literary forum, independent and nonprofit since 1975. You can learn more about them on their website at bostonreview.net. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Every week, we're hosting a slew of virtual events, and our schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to purchase Elizabeth's book. Your purchases and financial contributions, I will also share a link to donate, make this virtual author series possible, and now, more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has closed captioning available, and depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past year, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for patience and understanding. Elizabeth Hinton is the author of the critically acclaimed book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. One of the nation's leading experts on criminalization and policing, she's a professor at Yale, where her work focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence in the 20th century United States. You may also be familiar with her work that has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Boston Review, among many others. Tonight, she'll be talking with Derecka Purnell, a human rights lawyer, writer, and organizer who provides legal assistance, research, and training to community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, Boston Review, MSNBC, NPR, the Atlantic, and Harper's Bazaar, also among many others. Last summer's protests against police brutality took many by surprise, but for anyone paying attention, they were part of an ongoing movement of Americans, particularly Black Americans, standing up against injustice and structural inequity. In her new book, America on Fire, Elizabeth offers a re-examination of the civil rights era to today and the way protests have frequently been reframed as riots. Writing in the New York Times, Peniel Joseph says, through 10 crisply written and lucidly analytical chapters, Hinton reframes the conventional understanding of the long, hot summers of the 1960s and their aftermath. America on Fire chronicles how law enforcement became the nation's main policy tool, both for stemming urban unrest and for stifling Black demands for citizenship and dignity. One of this book's many virtues is the way it contextualizes the emergence, not just of the Black Lives Matter protests, but of our larger contemporary moment. And the Washington Post raves, not since Angela Davis's 2003 book, Are Prisons Obsolete, has a scholar so persuasively challenged our conventional understanding of the criminal legal system. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. The digital podium is yours, Elizabeth and Derecka.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that introduction. The host has spotlighted my video. That's a lot of pressure. I would prefer not to be spot. Is there a way to say spotlight in past tense? I would prefer not to be spotlit. if that's possible, but
we're both spot. I'm spotlit too.
Okay. So much better. How are you today?
I'm good. It's so good to see you, Derecka.
It's good to see you too. It's good to see you too. I'm happy that we get to do this now with people.
Yeah.
Because at first it was just you and I for the Boston Review's piece, and now we get to be in conversation with other people.
Yeah, and that conversation just wielded so many insights for me, especially, and one that I've been saying again and again, because this is like the final event of this, the book stuff that I've been doing for now, at least. I hope to pick up again in the fall. But one of the things that you said is that, while the protests themselves have become more nonviolent, which is true, the police have become more violent. And
Yes.
that, it's amazing. It's a great privilege to get to write a book and then talk about it with yourself and others who can then help you make sense of your own research in new ways. And so that's a point that I've been quoting you and I've been saying again and again, just to underscore. And it's something that I alluded to in the book, in terms of thinking about what the differences were between the kind of like Ferguson, post-Ferguson era and what I was describing in the late 60s and early 70s, but through the remainder of the 20th century. And I think we're not getting that enough, especially in the new conversations that we're having about policing in general that have increasingly, now moved away from some of the discussions about reform or transformation or defunding or abolition that were really grounding how we were thinking about these dynamics a year ago.
Yes, well, yes. Oh, thank you. I mean, that's, because of your book that I got to that revelation, just watching that history. And I'm excited to get there. We can talk about that a little bit later. It was just striking to me. And it's just thank you again for all of your research and hard work. And I hope everyone has already purchased the book. So they just get to see you talk about it. But if not, hopefully they'll get to learn a little bit more. So if you could talk about how the book came to be, that would be great.
So a lot of these questions came out of research that I was doing for my first book. I mean, one of the things, my first book is a history of federal crime control policy from the Kennedy administration through the Reagan administration. And one of the things that I really argued going against much of the conventional wisdom about the origins of mass incarceration and how we got to the war on crime and drugs is that the expansion of urban police forces beginning not in the 80s with Reagan, but in the mid 60s at the height of progressive social change with Johnson, was not in response to rising crime rates themselves and actual crime on the ground, but really in response to the threat of Black rebellion. So much of the policing strategies and the modernization of American law enforcement that we've been living, in during and after the civil rights movement was really about the fear of Black rebellion, which that fear of Black rebellion has been, one of the guiding policy principles in US history. And we see it taking on this new turn after the dismantling of Jim Crow. So that question was really central to me. And I dealt with, these episodes in the first book. I subscribe to the conventional narrative, even in that book. So I'm guilty of reifying the view that the rebellions began in Harlem in 64. They kind of peaked during the long hot summer of 67 in Newark and Detroit, and then the last kind of wave was the 100 or so that emerged after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April 1968. As I was researching my first book, I saw in the archives and in newspaper accounts that these kind of clashes between police and especially young people were continuing into the early 70s. And I happened to get access to an archive that of local newspaper clippings that highlighted this history that we hadn't seen.
Like Christmas. It's like Christmas for historians.
It literally was Christmas for historians. I was at a barbecue at my friend's house. I was talking to political scientist Christian Davenport. This was 2016. My book had just come out. He was getting ready to do a 50-year retrospective on the Detroit Rebellion. And I was like, did you know that these incidents continued? And he was like, into the 70s, actually, I have these records. And so he had the records of the Lemberg Center for the Study of Violence in his possession. The Lemberg Center opened in the mid 1960s to study conflict in American society. They did quantitative studies and oral histories and all kinds of newspaper clipping collections of not just Black rebellions, but the anti-war movement, school protests, labor disputes.
Yeah.
And I just was confronted with this treasure trove of newspaper clippings from small local news sources, not digitized. And you see these patterns and these stories and stories of boxes, one treasure trove of history, one Christmas present after another. And it was just kind of like showed that we were wrong about the actual history of rebellion in important ways, in that, between 64 and 68, including the rebellions after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, there are about 300 or so of these incidents. But it was after Lyndon Johnson signed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act into law in June 1968, which really launched the war on crime. This is when these federal grants moved from like the experimental ones that were hitting big cities to hitting, mid-sized, smaller towns, rural communities, really forcing states to set up crime control bureaucracies, that we really begin to see the explosion of rebellion. And that is between, the summer of 68 and through 1972, there are nearly 2,000 rebellions across the United States, in big cities, but also, again, in smaller towns in the South and the North. There's also this kind of idea that, rebellion was a phenomenon of the Northeast. And this really shows how communities responded to the expansion and the militarization of policing, and it was to fight back.
Right. Oh my gosh, so many different directions to go. The first I think is really important. Earlier in your point, you talked. I wrote it down because it was so important. Yes. So in response to the militarization of policing, in response to budget expansions, sometimes what's an impulse that I experience among lawyers, among academics, among even some organizers is to say, no, like there's no reason to fear like Black rebellion. Like that's like a made up thing used to justify, police force. Like it's a made up thing used to justify the expansion of policing. And I love about, this book is that it doesn't like shy away from that. It's like, no, Black people rebelled. They fought back, right? Like the resistance is important, and to deny the possibility of resistance is to not deny that history. And for as long, literally as long as there has been, people of African descent in North America, there's been rebellion, there's been resistance. The very first Black people who settled here because they rebelled against Spain, right? And so there's always has been this history of Black rebellion, Black resistance. And I'm curious about why you use rebellion and riot for people who haven't, instead of riot, for people who haven't read the book. If you wouldn't mind sharing that, I think it can illuminate the rest of our conversation.
Yeah, and just one quick point about the the fact that like people have kind of shied away from like the idea of rebellion, and that is, one of the big lessons here is that police violence causes or precipitates community violence. Like it is the response to a range of demands that are rooted in socioeconomic grievances with police and surveillance and imprisonment that then leads to community violence. So again, it's and this is related to why the term rebellion is so important. When Lyndon Johnson responded to Harlem in '64 by saying 3 days of unrest in the city that spread to a number of other cities throughout the summer, and he said, this has nothing to do with civil rights. This is criminal, it's lawless, it's meaningless, it's tied to crime and delinquency, and it's a riot. And calling it a riot and calling it criminal, then the only solution is more police, when the rebellions shared the same grievances of the mainstream civil rights movement. They were and so there, that's one part of it, trying to draw our attention to, these are acts of political protests when people feel they have no other recourse. I think one thing that's really important is that in all the cities where rebellion occurred, rebellion was, it didn't sprout out of nowhere. It came after years, if not decades, of nonviolent direct action protests, demonstrations, filing petitions, filing lawsuits, with little or no changes. And people feel after, not being heard and not seeing their living conditions change, that they have no other option. So that's part of it. It's trying to urge us to think about this form of protest as an actual form of protest and not just a criminal act. And
Mhm.
also, rebellion is how many of the people who embrace these sets of political tactics understood their own
Exactly.
actions.
Exactly.
So, in Detroit, my home state of Michigan, people don't call it the Detroit Riot of '67, they call it the Great Rebellion. Many of the people, from interviews to oral histories, that I've done, that the Lemberg Center, in that journalists documented, they weren't saying we're rioters. They're saying, like we're rebelling. We're rising up. That they're launching the people who participated, especially
Mhm.
the young people, have a very clearly articulated set of demands and set of explanations for why they're embracing these tactics. And some of it is just as basic as, like, for instance, like a reporter said, like, why are young people throwing, this was in Decatur, Illinois in '69, said, why are young people throwing rocks at police?
Right.
And the young man said, well, why are police hitting us with billy clubs? It's basic.
Very
Again, police
simple.
violence precipitates violence at the community level.
Right. I think what makes me nervous about the connection I'm about to put on the table is just how much that logic has been repeated and reiterated since 2014. So I remember during the Ferguson uprising, you have progressive, Barack Obama saying the people who burned down the Quick Trip in Ferguson, they're not, this has nothing to do with Michael Brown, right? These are criminals. This is criminal behavior. Where is this coming from? If we go earlier to Trayvon Martin, even when people are grieving and they're saying, no, we're hurting, this is an act of racial injustice and white supremacy, Obama essentially tells young protesters, hey, look, if you guys start rioting, I'm gonna have to come back out here and say something. And then in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's murder in Baltimore in 2015 in April, you have a similar incident, which what happened in Decatur in 1969. You have these kids who are throwing rocks at police, some of them back at police. And what do you have? You have a progressive, person in office, seemingly progressive person in office, who comes on camera, and what he says, I offer apologies and I have the hearts of the officers, in my heart. And I'm thinking about those who are hurt because the thugs are in the street. So what, in the aftermath of hearing a liberal, president condemn these protests, now we have a wave of anti-state, of anti-protest measures moving through all these House legislatures, right? In Florida, Missouri, and Texas, Michigan. They're trying to remove your food stamps. They're trying to remove your voting eligibility. They're trying to stop you from having access to unemployment. They are decreasing the penalty for people who decide to drive through protests. Right. And so you literally have a very similar continuity, I guess, of history, where you have a liberal administration condemn the violence, and then all of these conservative administrations then go and criminalize the protests. So I'm just curious about some of the connections you're making with the acts of Black rebellion under liberal administrations and then the subsequent response.
Yeah, and I think one thing that, from like Johnson to Obama, there's never like a moment to question, well, like, let's actually, instead of pointing fingers and calling people thugs, because that's also and hoodlums, that's what Johnson loved, the term hoodlums. There was never like a step back to say, oh, why is it that people why is it that this is the response among these young people? Right. Like let's actually try to understand why this is happening. Or instead of saying, okay, well, it seems like the programs of the war on crime aren't working. Instead, the response is, okay, well, the war on poverty is not working, so let's just increase the war on crime. There's no question about whether or not the appropriate strategy is to increase police force. And that's been the policy cycle that we've been on. One of the things that's interesting, in the Johnson administration, and I come back to this a lot, is the Kerner Commission did actually try to think about, what are the larger socioeconomic factors that are causing people to embrace this form of violence, and what might the solutions be? And Johnson refused to even, comment on the report. But but I think, the refusal to kind of question the larger factors by liberal administrations from Johnson to Clinton to Obama, and the dynamic that you mentioned, Derecka, about as all of these new restrictions and new penalties for protests are being enacted, at the same time, there's also now allowing people to do car rammings into protests. And we know that, those car rammings, which have become a staple of counter protests since Charlottesville, which led to the death of Heather Heyer, one of the white women who was protesting there, and a number of them last summer by like the white or vigilante or militia groups, really shows again like whose protests are legitimate, whose power is the state going to sanction. And I think one strong current throughout the history of the United States is that racial justice protests are always criminalized. Even nonviolent protests of the civil rights movement were criminalized, deeply criminalized. The response, as we saw, was German shepherds and tear gas and hoses against children. And the response to white supremacist vigilante group violence has been, as we saw on January 6th, at least among some officers, to open the doors of the Capitol, to pose for selfies with people, to pass legislation that allows people to ram into groups of protesters and kill them without legal repercussions. And so, so much of these problems are not about party systems. They're partisan. They're not partisan. They're about systemic issues, and they're about the way in which liberal social policy has historically upheld and in some cases exacerbated structural racism. Liberals, I think that's one of the big revelations of or contributions of my work and my critique of the Johnson administration, is that it shows how racist assumptions have stained liberal social policy, and especially when it comes to crime control, these assumptions run through both liberal and conservative approaches to the issue and to urban problems and the allocation of resources in general.
Yeah, I mean, the other major takeaway from the book, I told you this before, is just the expansion, the recent expansion of federal funding for policing. I hadn't known that history. And so federal funding for police seems so inevitable. It seems so normal. It seems so natural even, that the federal government is giving billions of dollars to local police departments. And that it only started as recently as the 1960s and has led to these huge budgets. And in one sense, like I said, I was just shocked. In another sense, like, oh yeah, right. Defunding the police is not just a local issue, even though it's hugely local, but it's not solely a local issue when not only you have, cops under DOJ, but you have all of these other, Office of Juvenile Detention, delinquency, like all of these other programs, VAWA, that's pouring in so many federal dollars to local police departments, right? Not even just the military equipment, but yeah, it's a huge funding allocation resource, So in one sense, it's just like, well, what is that for? Part of it is to stop Black rebellion, but to actually undermine the conditions that cause people to rebel is much more expensive than paying for police, right? It's a cost benefits analysis to some degree, at least I think, right? It's like, well, what would it take to undermine poverty in the US? And what would it take to employ a bunch of people? This is probably Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, whose work I'm thinking about now. How can we make sure there's a jobs program to manage all of this resistance, to manage this rebellion, right? To manage these uprisings? And I'm curious about where you see the future. If history can teach us anything about the resource allocation from the Johnson administration, what do you think this is gonna, what do you think the outlook is gonna be? If we look now, I see the rise of Black police officers becoming mayors, moving into higher administration of the federal government. There seems to actually be a lot of support for cops right now, given even given the level of the movement. So I'm very curious about any forecasts you may be able to offer us about the resource allocation for the coming years.
Yeah, so I think, this is, and without getting into the like nerdy wonky weeds of budget stuff and block grants and all this, but this was the question of the Johnson administration, right? I mean, because this is where you both have this war on poverty and the war on crime operating in tandem and reinforcing one another. And unfortunately, the war on crime became the structural intervention. The war on poverty was never the structural intervention. And, you have to ask yourself what would have happened had federal policymakers put the resources and the energy into social welfare programs. So, the Office of Economic Opportunity that steered the community action programs, the war on poverty, never became a more permanent agency. But the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance that similarly directed the grants of the war on crime became the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which took hold after the enactment of that Safe Streets Act in June 68 that I mentioned earlier, and essentially forced states to make crime control a priority by requiring them to plan, essentially to set up criminal justice planning agencies, as they were called, at the state level and in some big cities in order to qualify for this new federal grant funding. And so when the federal government starts allocating hundreds of millions of dollars to crime control, then states follow suit. And by the time, when Nixon takes office, the social welfare programs become disinvested from. And, if people want any funds for social programs, I mean, especially by the 80s and 90s, it's got to come in the form of these crime control grants. And this is why I think the federal stuff is so important, because, the history of the war on crime and the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration and these federal law enforcement assistance grants does kind of lay out a potential framework for an alternative. I mean, the Johnson administration, in modernizing American police and kind of like setting the nation on the road to mass incarceration, ensured that in the moment when domestic manufacturing was declining, that the crime control security apparatus would become a new American industry.
Yes.
And so, there is a precedent simultaneously in the war on poverty that I think could be really important for thinking about what the federal government's role might be today in public safety, because I do think that there is, people say, well, crime control is a local issue and the federal government has anything to do with it, and that's not true. And we can't disentangle the history of federal intervention from reality, which is that the federal government has played an important role in shaping what crime control looks like on the ground, and certainly shaping local strategies. And during the first year of the war on poverty, it was really only the first year the federal government, through community action programs under the principle of maximum feasible participation that was written into the Economic Opportunity Act, said, okay, those essentially what many of us in the movement today say, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Poor people know better how to address the needs of their communities than outsiders. So therefore, what the federal government can and should do is grant grassroots organizations money to address the problem of poverty on their own. And these really exciting grant programs lasted for a year, where like the federal government is granting local organizations millions of dollars. And local officials didn't like this. They felt like too much power was being ceded to the people.
Sounds real Freedom Bureau-esque.
Right, exactly. And law enforcement, by the end of the 60s, so many of these programs became institutionalized. And by the end of the 60s, law enforcement took on a more prominent role, so that like many of the like after school programs that were run by community action workers in 65, 66, by 68, 69 had become police recreation programs. We never got that job creation program for low-income Americans that the Kerner Commission had advocated, but we got the job creation program for police. So I do think that we're going to need federal leadership, and that that leadership should come in the form of, reallocating resources, not only to jobs programs and healthcare resources and educational opportunities and housing, but also in ceding power and investing resources in local community groups who are doing the most exciting work on these issues anyway, who are actually reforming public safety and fostering public safety in communities that in ways that police are just ill-equipped to and cannot by definition. I mean, if we're serious about public safety, if we're serious about addressing gun violence, the police are not the answer. I mean, I think that's the other.
They're literally not the answer. Yes.
Right. I mean, I think that's the last, I think, takeaway from this work and from this history is that, now we know after more than 5 decades that responding to problems of racial inequality, discrimination, poverty with police and with prisons has failed. It does not work. Again, that response to homicide rates, reported homicide rates are rising. So therefore we must need more police. It should be reported homicide rates are rising. Therefore policing isn't working.
Exactly.
These policies have failed. And so now we cannot look to police as a solution. We have to look to community groups as a solution who actually, are promoting safety and reducing harm in their neighborhoods in ways, again, that police are incapable of doing.
Yeah, I mean, I love when Miriam Kaba says something to this effect, maybe not directly, just that police are basically the only profession that does a poor job and continues to get more funding, right? Yes. More funding, despite the results.
Right.
So we have 2 questions that both are related. One's about funding, one's about community police. Would you like to choose one over the other?
I haven't read them, so you choose for me.
Okay, let's do the first one. The first one's from Dustin Gibson. If this is the Dustin Gibson that I know, hello, Dustin. Thank you for joining us. And if not, still hello. Dustin asks, can you speak about community police as a state response to rebellions in the 60s? And if you see any connections to the current reform efforts?
Yeah, so first of all, when we say community policing, it's one of those terms, it's really unclear what we're actually talking about, because I mean, in practice, this is a side note. In practice, community policing also means zero tolerance policing. It means aggressively enforcing misdemeanors, and other police departments. It might be more officers on foot patrol. It could mean a bunch of different things. But one thing that is a thread is that, from the Kerner Commission on down, the response is, okay, we have to improve relations between police and community groups. And there's always a call to expanding or creating a community relations unit. The idea that the idea that officers would have a more intimate relationship with the community. Usually, yes, I mean, what happened in the 60s and 70s are these these new storefront precincts. I talk about this a lot in my first book, and this is, again, part of this merger of crime control and social welfare, where police are becoming, while social welfare programs are being divested from under this kind of community policing paradigm, police are seen as increasingly taking on the role of social workers. They're running, again, these recreational programs for youth. They're in these precinct storefront offices that are supposed to, increase trust. This is the idea also behind what becomes school resource officers, bringing police into schools. And what this form of police, community policing does is impose new levels of surveillance, soft surveillance in targeted communities. The goal is still the same, right? It is to, and this is, the guiding strategy of the war on crime and policing in low-income communities of color. It is to arrest potential criminals, potential rioters, potential delinquents. That this category of potential criminal is what was used legislatively in the 60s and 1970s. It's not even a response to actual crime, but the idea that certain groups of people are latently criminal. So having police there ready
To prevent.
to prevent crime, to arrest people. Again, this is the logic behind broken windows and zero tolerance. If you can arrest people who are like the squeegee man, or arrest people who are truants skipping school, or arrest people who are jaywalking and throw them in jail and slap fines on them, then you'll surely prevent them from committing an even more harmful act, right? And again, this is all this does. This serves then as a criminogenic force that creates crime and violence. So these strategies have failed. I mean, the answer, if true community policing is the way that I think about it is residents are responsible. People who live in communities are responsible for the public safety of their neighbors, of their loved ones. It's not, you cannot have an outsider who doesn't live in the community, who doesn't know the community, who maybe usually is scared of the community, come into a community with a uniform and a gun and a squad car and a body cam and expect there to naturally be trust if that person, chooses to engage in dialogue, in part because of the power dynamics that are at play, and in part because of what the, what the function of policing is and has been historically.
Yeah, I mean, you can't even, it's interesting that one big reform effort has been making sure that people who are on police forces live in the communities that they represent. That was huge in Ferguson, given the demographics of the police department compared to the demographics of the city. And then one silver bullet was, well, we need to make sure that people who police here live here. One major issue is that assumption, it assumes that knowledge will prevent violence, right? That if you know the people in your community, then, or you live in a zip code, you live in the city, as if cities are not also very segregated, as if neighborhoods are not already very segregated, as if the police, especially police forces in the US, the rates of domestic violence, like in the homes of cops, committed by cops, they know their partners, right? And so what also happens at the cops, at least in my neighborhood that we knew, we were like, oh man, now this person, they're always a cop because they live here. So now when they're off duty, they're basically on patrol. And it's just like, well, we don't want people who live in our neighborhoods to be cops either, because they're never off duty and we can't live freely. And so it's a lose-lose, just a lose-lose situation. So what should we do? The next question is from an anonymous attendee. Hello. They ask, what should be the first step in redistributing funds from the police? Is there one issue that should be prioritized over others?
For me, and I'd love to hear what your response to this would be, Derecka. For me, I really think we need jobs. I think that there needs to be a really robust job creation program. We need jobs and educational opportunities, but for me, I think employment, being able to make a decent income, to make enough to buy property, to provide for your family, to engage in work that you see as meaningful. I think that is the issue. I think that's been the issue. One of the things in the book that consistently came up, and that participants in rebellions demanded first and foremost, were jobs, not like the job training programs of the war on poverty, but actual jobs. I mean, that was one of the problems with the war on poverty, is that there were all these job training programs, but you what are you going to do if you're trained to do something and you can't actually get employed? So for me, I think that the big issue is jobs.
Yeah, no, oh man, this is a hard question. I don't know if there's like a first step. I sort of see these things as like a color wheel. Imagine like a wheel and a bunch of different slices, all sort of leading towards the center. And each one, I'm totally thinking about this right now, but each one of these like slices in this wheel like has a purpose, right? And so one first step in this wheel could be eliminating federal funding for cops. Like if we need to start assessing all the ways that cops are being funded and start reducing that. So I would have that on the slice. I would have another slice that's analyzing 911 calls. I think that's hugely important work to see why are people inviting cops into their homes. If they are, what kinds of calls are being placed? You know, how can we start reducing our reliance based on these sorts of like calls, you know, doing that from the community level, doing that from the dispatcher level. I think employment is absolutely important. I think universal basic income I will also have on that slice. So there's a bunch of different things that people I think are experimenting with, but ultimately they all sort of need to work together to get the wheel going. Yes, I'll stop there because there's a very, very, very important question. I love this question. Is there anything that didn't make it into the book that you think is still worth mentioning?
Ooh, that is really good. There's so much that didn't make it into the book, because going back to the Christmas and the art, and I'm like an archive. I love the archives. It's like, it's my happy. It's not for everybody because it's a very alienating experience, but it's my happy place. And there's so many stories that just couldn't make it into the book. I mean, there were, you know, nearly 2,000 of these incidents. And each one of them has its own depth and characters and struggle. And so there are many that I couldn't tell. And in some of them that I wrote up that literally, you know, just didn't make it, you know, that hit the cutting room floor and didn't make it back in. And, you know, I might maybe I'll have an opportunity to do something with down the road. But I think, yeah, I mean, there are just too many stories to name. But there are many. And I hope, I mean, one of the things that excites me most about the book is the timeline of Black rebellions that I was able to include at the end. It's almost 25 pages. And this really shows, you know, that this is a national history, that we all have a stake in it. I imagine that most readers, or many readers, will be able to find their hometowns or a place that they live near, or a place that they lived at some point of their lives in that timeline. And, you know, I hope it opens up for communities and for future researchers, scholars, people who are interested, you know, a new opportunity to consider these histories and dive in and tell these stories, because it is such a rich part of the freedom struggle, of the history of Black protests, of the movement, the ongoing movement and project towards social justice and equity, that there's so much to contribute there. So I guess that, without getting into too much detail on the stories themselves, but yeah, just actually choosing what could go in. Again, I talked probably about, like, maybe I mentioned 30 rebellions, and there were, you know, nearly 2,000 in the period that I'm really concerned with. And so I had to leave a lot out, and that was tough.
I mean, what's incredible is that you have all these rebellions, but you also have these quotidian acts of resistance that, to me, are as important as the rebellions, right? You have the kids throwing rocks. You have, I don't want to give it all away because I'm so sensitive to spoilers.
No,
so
you can spoil
tell me what's in the book. I'm
fine.
just like, no. But even like some of the shootouts, I'm just like, what? People were having shootouts with police in the projects, like they were like claiming territory. All of that is, I think, so important for people to understand. Even people who are critical or disagree with, you know, violence and self-defense as a tactic. I think what it shows, it at least counters this narrative that people are waiting in the streets to like turn up on police. And it's like, you actually have no idea what people were willing to do and sacrifice in order to like stop police violence, right? I think it's just such an important reminder that we just need that history, and you've given that to us in this book, and I'm really grateful for it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the book really underscores, and again, in like shifting the kind of conventional narrative of this is, that like as these new federal crime war programs hit, this was the response. Like communities fought back. Black people fought back. The people who were the most targeted by these policies, and federal policymakers believed that Black youth between the ages of 15 and 24 were responsible for the majority of crime in the US and targeted them. And really, that group responded to that criminalization by saying, no, like this is not, we want jobs. We want Black studies curriculum in our school. We want decent housing, fix our housing, and fought back. And that, as we think about public safety today, as we think about policing, that is a really important lesson. And we should take that history seriously, and the demands of those who embraced violent political rebellion seriously, if we're ever to get out of this, if we're ever to create an equitable and free society.
Yes. Now I want you to talk about critical race theory, because it's so, when I hadn't thought about it till you just said it. Yes, there were all these students on campus resisting, fighting, like literally sacrificing their lives for Black studies programs, like resisting police violence. Police went in to like shut them down. And to watch this critical race theory conversation happen first online and then in the media, and now, I think Florida has banned critical race theory. It's so like, it's all very, very, very silly. But it also made me wonder, okay, where's the resistance? Is the resistance only going to be like on Twitter, right? Or where are the students who are going to start walking out? When are the sit-ins going to start? Where is the reason? I hope that we get to draw from this history and learn that, no, you can do more than like tweet that you're angry that this is happening, right? You have lots of options.
Yeah, and I think, we're in this moment with the attack on the attack on the truth, and this like anti-democratic, the minority who are doing everything that they can to create illusions and falsities about our history and about power. Yeah, I mean, I think, this is another like larger question that of course is related, but that, democracy is at stake, it's under attack. A minority threatens to take over and do everything they can to hold power. And it's up to us. And we know this from, the history of rebellion and resistance and protest, to fight that and to resist that, or else, we risk losing, that democracy. We risk losing the right to vote,
Right.
which many of us only very recently have been able to exercise. And again, in the moment that the franchise opened up, so did policing and so did incarceration. So we must keep fighting. I mean, that's the lesson. We keep fighting. We get to the streets. We keep reading. We keep discussing. We will triumph.
Wow, I think that's a lovely note to end on. We will triumph. That was, yeah, just thank you. Thank you for the book. Thank you for all of your work. Thank you for being in a conversation. Again, I always learn something. And so I've more to sit with, but I'm happy that we will, ultimately be triumphant.
Thank you. And let me just say, just real quick, it's always an honor to be in conversation with you, Derecka. And I have also had the honor of reading an advanced version of Derecka's new book that's coming out in October, right? Becoming Abolitionists. It is absolutely incredible. Only a few months away. So I'm looking forward to that also being out in the world and the conversations that are sure to come. So everybody here should definitely be on the lookout for that and pre-order it. Pre-order it now from Harvard Bookstore.
No, but right now, no, buy your book right now. Don't pre-order my book right now. Buy this book right now.
Do both.
They can get both.
Support Black women. Support independent bookstores.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Derecka, for this fantastic conversation that was just riveting. And thank you to everyone out there in the audience for spending your night with us. You can learn more about and purchase Elizabeth's book and go to Derecka's on our website via harvard.com or via the link in the chat. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.